For 8 long years, Aurora Whitmore lived inside the grand Ashford Manor, yet no one ever truly welcomed her as family. The mansion stood high on a lonely mountain ridge where winter winds screamed through ancient pine trees, making the enormous stone walls feel more like a prison than a home. Every hallway echoed with expensive silence. Every room sparkled with luxury. But warmth had disappeared long before Aurora arrived. At only 18 years old, she had married Adrian Ashford, the eldest son of one of Montana's wealthiest ranching dynasties. Her parents had been ordinary people who believed their daughter would find happiness in a respected family. Aurora herself believed love could slowly grow after marriage if she remained patient and kind. Instead, she discovered that some hearts were colder than snow. Adrian never shouted at her, never insulted her before others, and never raised his hand. His cruelty was quieter than that. He simply ignored her existence. They shared the same mansion but never the same life. Separate bedrooms became their routine after the wedding. Separate meals followed. Separate mornings turned into separate years. Whenever guests visited, Adrian stood beside Aurora only long enough for photographs before disappearing into business meetings and family gatherings, leaving her alone among strangers who smiled politely but never invited her into their conversations. Aurora slowly stopped expecting affection. She perfected the art of smiling while feeling invisible. She learned everyone's favorite tea, remembered birthdays, organized charity events, and cared for the elderly servants as if they were relatives. Yet no one ever asked how she was feeling. Every morning she sat alone in the breakfast room overlooking the snow-covered valley, drinking tea while staring through frozen windows. Even the servants pitied her, though they rarely dared to show it. Only young housemaid Emma quietly placed fresh flowers beside Aurora's plate every morning, hoping a little color might brighten the lonely woman's day. Aurora thanked her with gentle smiles that never reached her tired eyes. At 26, she still wore her wedding ring every day, although it felt heavier than chains. Looking into the mirror had become painful because she barely recognized herself anymore. The cheerful village girl had disappeared. In her place stood a graceful woman who had mastered silence so perfectly that even her own sadness no longer made a sound. She often wondered whether disappearing completely would make any difference inside Ashford Manor, because sometimes being forgotten while still alive hurts far more than being alone. That same morning, as Aurora quietly finished her breakfast, an unfamiliar sound echoed through the mansion. It was laughter, loud, genuine, and completely out of place inside Ashford Manor. Every servant stopped for a moment in surprise because no one laughed like that under this roof. Aurora slowly lifted her eyes toward the doorway just as a tall man stepped inside, brushing snow from his brown leather coat. His name was Ethan Ashford, Adrian's younger brother, who had spent years traveling across the country after refusing to become part of the family's cold traditions. Unlike Adrian, whose face always remained unreadable, Ethan carried warmth wherever he went. His smile filled empty rooms and his eyes noticed things others deliberately ignored. The moment he saw Aurora sitting alone at the enormous dining table prepared for only one person, his cheerful expression slowly disappeared. He looked at the untouched chair beside her, then toward the silent servants and finally at his older brother, who entered the room moments later with the same distant expression he always wore. "So this is how you've lived all these years?" Ethan asked quietly. No one answered. Adrian simply walked toward the coffee table as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan looked back at Aurora. "Have you eaten breakfast alone every day?" She lowered her eyes and forced a small smile. "I'm used to it." Those 4 words struck Ethan harder than any accusation could have. He pulled out a chair and sat beside her without asking permission. For the first time in years, someone chose to share her table. Adrian frowned but remained silent. Ethan picked up a piece of toast and casually poured himself tea before saying, "A house this beautiful shouldn't feel this lonely." The servants exchanged nervous glances. Nobody dared speak while the Ashford brothers faced each other. Ethan finally turned toward Adrian and asked the question no one had ever dared to ask. "When was the last time you looked at your wife and actually saw her?" Adrian remained expressionless. "This isn't your concern." Ethan shook his head. It became my concern the moment I realized everyone here treats her like she's part of the furniture. Aurora's fingers tightened around her teacup. She wanted the conversation to end before it became worse. Please don't argue because of me. Ethan smiled gently at her before replying. I'm not arguing because of you. I'm speaking because nobody else ever did. Adrian's jaw tightened. You've been here less than 10 minutes. Ethan stood and looked directly into his brother's eyes. 10 minutes were enough to notice what you've ignored for 8 years. Those words filled the room with unbearable silence. For the first time since their marriage, Adrian slowly turned toward Aurora instead of looking past her. She lifted her eyes for only a second before lowering them again, unaware that something inside her husband had shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't love yet. It wasn't regret either. But for the first time in years, guilt quietly knocked on the door of a heart that had almost forgotten how to feel. The days that followed became strangely different. Ethan refused to let the silence return to Ashford Manor. He invited Aurora to join him for breakfast, asked about the books she loved, walked with her through the snow-covered gardens and listened whenever she spoke. At first, Aurora answered with only a few words because she had forgotten what it felt like to be heard. Little by little, however, her gentle smile returned. The servants noticed the change before anyone else. Fresh flowers appeared in her room every morning. Laughter echoed through the long hallways again, and even the old mansion seemed less cold. Adrian watched everything from a distance. He never interrupted them, yet something inside him became heavier each passing day. One evening he found an old wedding photograph tucked inside a forgotten drawer. Aurora was smiling with hope in her eyes, while he stood beside her, wearing the same distant expression he still carried today. For the first time he realized that she had not changed overnight. She had slowly stopped shining because he had never given her a reason to. That realization haunted him. Late one winter night, a fierce snowstorm surrounded the mansion. Thunder rolled across the mountains while icy wind rattled every window. Adrian, unable to sleep, walked quietly through the hallway. As he passed Aurora's bedroom, he heard a faint voice from inside. At first he thought she was awake, but when he gently opened the door, he saw her asleep beneath a blanket, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. Her breathing was uneven as though she were trapped inside a painful dream. Then he heard her whisper through trembling lips, Adrian, please don't leave me. I tried so hard. The words froze him where he stood. 8 years of silence suddenly became impossible to ignore. She had never stopped loving him. Even in her dreams, she was still reaching for the man who had spent years walking away. Adrian slowly sat beside her bed, his hands trembling for the first time in years. Without thinking, he carefully brushed a strand of hair away from her face. Aurora instinctively held his hand while still asleep, as if her heart recognized the comfort it had been searching for all along. Tears filled Adrian's eyes. Wealth, power, and success had earned him everything except the one thing quietly slipping away beside him every single day. Before dawn, he whispered words Aurora could not hear. I'm sorry. I should have chosen you every day. When morning sunlight finally entered the room, Aurora opened her eyes and found a warm blanket gently covering her shoulders, a cup of fresh tea waiting beside her bed, and a single handwritten note resting beside it. It contained only one sentence. If you'll give me one chance, I'd like to learn how to be your husband. For the first time in 8 years, hope entered Ashford Manor before the sun. Aurora held the handwritten note in trembling hands long after the tea beside her had turned cold. She read the single sentence again and again, unable to believe Adrian had written it. For years she had dreamed of hearing even one kind word from him. Yet now that it had finally come, her heart refused to trust it. Hope had disappointed her too many times. She carefully folded the note and placed it inside her favorite book, not because she believed everything had changed, but because it was the first proof that perhaps her pain had finally been seen. Downstairs, however, Ashford Manor remained wrapped in uneasy silence. Adrian sat alone in his father's old study, staring at a dusty photograph from 8 years earlier. It showed the day of their wedding. Everyone else smiled proudly, but Aurora's bright smile was the only real happiness in the picture. His own face looked distant, almost unwilling. Ethan quietly entered the room without knocking. "You're finally looking at her," he said softly. Adrian didn't answer immediately. After several moments, he whispered, "I never hated Aurora." Ethan crossed his arms. "Then why did you spend 8 years making her believe you did?" Adrian closed his eyes. "Because I blamed her for something that was never her fault." The confession hung heavily in the room. He finally spoke about the truth he had buried for years. A week before the wedding, Adrian had discovered that his father had secretly threatened Aurora's struggling family. Their small ranch had been drowning in debt after her mother's illness. His father had offered to save them on one condition: that Aurora marry into the Ashford family. Adrian believed she had accepted only for money and security. Feeling betrayed, he entered the marriage with a heart already closed, refusing to ask whether the story was true. He built walls instead of asking questions. He punished silence with more silence. Ethan looked at his brother in disbelief. "Did you ever ask Aurora if she wanted this marriage?" Adrian lowered his head. "No." "Did you ever ask if she knew your father had forced the arrangement?" Again, Adrian whispered. "No." Ethan sighed deeply. "Then you never judged her. You judged a story you created yourself." At that exact moment, Aurora stood quietly outside the study door. She had come only to return the empty teacup left in her room, but every word reached her ears. Tears slowly filled her eyes. For 8 years she had believed Adrian simply didn't love her. Now she finally understood the cruel misunderstanding that had stolen their marriage before it had even begun. She wanted to walk away, yet her feet refused to move. Behind the closed door, Adrian's voice broke for the first time. "If I had asked her one honest question, neither of us would have lost 8 years." Aurora covered her mouth to stop herself from crying aloud. Some wounds are caused by hatred, but the deepest ones are born from words that were never spoken. Quietly walked back to her room before either of the brothers noticed she had been standing outside the study. Her heart felt heavier than ever. For 8 years, she had carried the pain of believing she was unloved, yet now she knew Adrian had built his distance on a lie created by his father. The truth did not erase her suffering, but it answered the question that had haunted her every lonely night. She sat beside the window where snow continued falling over the mountains and slowly unlocked the bottom drawer of her bedside table. Hidden beneath a stack of folded scarves was a small wooden box covered with dust. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters, each carefully folded and tied with a faded blue ribbon. Every letter was addressed to Adrian, but none had ever been given to him. Whenever her heart became too heavy, she had written everything she wished she could say instead of speaking aloud. The first letter was written only 3 days after their wedding. It read, "I know you don't know me yet, but I promise I'll spend my life trying to make you proud." Another said, "I made your favorite soup today. I hope one day you'll eat dinner with me." One letter simply contained the words, "Happy anniversary. I still waited for you." As the years passed, the letters became shorter, filled with quiet tears instead of hope. The final one had been written only a week earlier. It said, "I don't know how much longer my heart can keep loving someone who never looks back. But I pray that one day you find peace, even if it is without me." Aurora held that letter against her chest and silently cried. At the same time, downstairs, Ethan entered the old library carrying several dusty storage boxes that had belonged to their late father. While searching through old business files, a sealed envelope slipped onto the floor. Across the front, written in bold handwriting, were the words, "To Adrian, open before your wedding." Ethan frowned. The envelope had never been opened. He immediately carried it to his brother. Adrian stared at it in confusion before slowly breaking the seal. Inside was a single letter from his father admitting the truth. He confessed that Aurora had refused the marriage several times because she wanted a marriage built on love, not obligation. Only after her parents faced losing everything did she finally agree, begging him never to tell Adrian about the threats against her family because she didn't want him to hate his own father. Adrian's hands began to shake so violently that the letter slipped onto the floor. Every belief he had held for 8 years shattered in a single moment. Aurora had never married for money. She had sacrificed her own happiness to save the people she loved. And in return, she had been punished with years of loneliness. Adrian sank into the chair, tears filling his eyes as he whispered brokenly, "She protected everyone, even me." For the first time in his life, he understood that the woman he had ignored for 8 years had loved him more deeply than he had ever deserved.